So my name's Aly Thompson. I work at the Civil Aviation Authority. Joined the session today to be your moderator. And joining me are Ben Brown and Claire Walton. So my role at the CAA, I work in external relations. So I do a bit of strategic engagement, media management, general comms, general engagement, and kind of whatever else they throw at me. Claire is a master's student at Massey University, has been researching a very important topic around violence and aggression towards remotely piloted aircraft pilots and their ground crew. She's also got a fairly extensive background in aviation, having been a commercial pilot for over 25 years. And Ben Brown joins us from Programmed, which is a facilities management company, and he is their service delivery manager for digital asset capture. I think we can run a little competition about who's got the fanciest title, and it's probably going to be Ben. All three of us are also recently joined a working group that UAVNZ has set up around the public acceptance of drones and UAVs. Now, you're going to have to excuse me for saying drones all the time. I know that when we're talking technical lingo, UAVs is broader than just drones, but it just rolls off the tongue. So I hope you won't chastise me for that too much. So we've joined this working group UAVNZ has set up just about exploring what we might be able to do in terms of influencing the public's acceptance of UAVs. The working group's in its early stages. We've just had 2 meetings so far, but we may make recommendations. Our role is to make recommendations to UAVNZ about things that we think could be done. So very keen to hear some thoughts from you all today. Happy for you to drop ideas into the Q&A or the chat. We've got a couple of polls there as well, which we'll get to today. And just before we crack into one of the presentations, we will have a little look at who's with us today. So there's a poll in there. What kind of UAV operator are you? Now this should show up in your Hoover screen if you're doing it on a browser, or in the Hoover app if you've downloaded the app to your phone. Now I'm fairly new to Hoover, so I'm not really an expert in how to explain to you where to find it. So if it's not self-explanatory, you're on your own. Claire or Ben, feel free to jump in if either of you have got the app. But there's a poll there asking you which kind of UAV operator you are. So whether you're recreational, semi-professional, or professional, or other, or if you don't fly UAVs, that's also an option. Now we have a loose definition there of what is semi-professional and professional, and we've just borrowed that from Claire's categorization in her research. Acknowledge that there could be a lot of different ways to categorize different types of drone users, but we're just trying to get something that's a little bit indicative today. So doesn't look like I've got a lot of responses on that, which suggests to me that I might have done something wrong. We can move on though. If people can't see it or can't get to it, then that's going to be fun later on in the piece. Does anybody just want to raise a hand and offer me, help me out and tell me if you can actually see that poll? Any one of the attendees? Steve, you're a champion. What do you see there, Steve?
I see you and you on screen and the 4 polls.
You can see the polls.
I can see the polls. I've worked with the polls. It's the one which is impact on your operations, because I don't operate UAVs.
Right. Okay. So if everybody would go and see if you can find it and answer that, because we are interested to know who's joined us today. Maybe my system just needs to be refreshed. Aha! The system wasn't updating the numbers, so that's great. So I've got 22 responses there. So one person has responded saying recreational, 9 of the 22 are semi-professional, 7 people professional, 2 people have signaled other, and 3 have said I don't fly UAVs, and I'm one of those. So great. Thank you, Steve, for your technical support. I will mute you now. All right, so Claire's going to kick off first with a presentation for us. So Claire, over to you.
Sorry, took me some time to figure out how to unmute. So today, my research is actually asking uncrewed aircraft pilots or ground crew what they have actually experienced. However, prior to that, I started to research what is the current, what are everybody else worldwide researching, just to see if there was a gap in the knowledge. And so that's what my presentation is about today, is what's the current worldwide research. So first of all, I do need to say that my access to current research is through Massey University, and they don't have access to every single journal article in the world, so there may be some missing. Also, I have chosen to search since 2015 because that's almost 10 years, and any more than this, I think public opinion possibly may have changed. There it is. First of all, I also thought I would talk about researchers who are doing the research. So many of the researchers have pretty much lumped everybody in together: air taxi, military, uncrewed aircraft, remotely piloted aircraft, all into one piece of research. So during this discussion, keep that in mind, that it's not just what you know as a drone. When they ask their research participants questions, they're asking pretty broad overall. So I will call everything unmanned aircraft. So as far as who were the participants in the majority of the research, there's actually been over 28,000 people included in research from all over the world: America, Canada, Europe, the UK, Australia, Malaysia, and Singapore. So this is just since 2015. There may have been more countries prior to that. As far as the age of the participants that were asked, it ranges from 13 and up to well above 65 plus. Mostly they're questioning the public. However, there are some research participants who have been included who either work with or own uncrewed aircraft. So that might be someone like an FAA employee or a NASA employee or someone in the general industry. However, very early in the piece, one thing I noticed was all of the research is very, very focused on the public. What's the public's knowledge around uncrewed aircraft? What's the public's opinions and attitudes around uncrewed aircraft? What's acceptable or unacceptable uses as far as the public's concerned for uncrewed aircraft, and a little bit about victimization, privacy, and a little bit about noise. Otherwise, there are some very specific research about whether or not the public approve of uncrewed aircraft use for police or lifeguards, or in conservation, shark surveillance, or parcel delivery. So there's also some very, very specific research as well. What the researchers found, is that most people know what a drone is. Very few of their participants knew any other term. They didn't know what an RPAS or an RPA or UAS or UAV was. One point that I have underlined in bold is that somewhere between 65 and 80% of the knowledge that the public has comes from TV or social media and news platforms. So that's even at the bottom end of that scale, 65%. That's a lot that they're learning from social media or places that may not be quite reliable. Overall, knowledge is fairly limited about uncrewed aircraft and what they do. On a large scale overall, participants with greater knowledge about uncrewed aircraft were more likely to be positive towards uncrewed aircraft. However, greater knowledge didn't necessarily equate or correspond with greater support for uncrewed aircraft. Sometimes it was found, or the researchers found, that greater knowledge may actually give the public a greater ability to identify what applications they supported and what applications they didn't support. Overall, male, I didn't find this too surprising, male participants had more knowledge than female. Younger participants had a lot more knowledge than older participants. Lower education participants generally had lower support for uncrewed aircraft. There is one small difference, which we will discuss a little bit later on, where that was different. Otherwise, urban participants were a lot more supportive than suburban or rural participants for uncrewed aircraft. One thing that surprised me, having come from crewed aviation, is that there's very little support from anyone in the crewed aviation industry for uncrewed aviation. And researchers also found that participants who had not heard of an application, who didn't understand what an application was, had a lower or a lot less support for uncrewed aircraft. So that might be if someone had heard of parcel delivery, if they hadn't heard of parcel delivery, they had a lot less support for parcel delivery if they didn't know what that was. So one of the main confusions of participants' knowledge was where the pilot is. A lot of the research participants didn't really understand exactly where the pilot was. Two more details that some of the researchers noticed was often participants were asked in the research to give an opinion on an application they had absolutely no exposure to. For example, someone in the city had to give an opinion on whether they accepted crop spraying, and they had no knowledge of agriculture or horticulture, so they really were given an opinion on things that they didn't really understand, even without the uncrewed aircraft. Another detail that was noted is participants sometimes had heard of an application. For example, they may have heard of parcel delivery via social media, but they didn't understand how that would work in a practical sense. They didn't understand, would the parcel just drop from the air, would the drone or would the uncrewed aircraft land, or what would the sky be filled with uncrewed aircraft? So that was some of the gaps in the participants' knowledge. The researchers came up, they specifically asked the research participants what they would and wouldn't accept. So what I've done is put everything in groups so that it can be a bit more clear. But one of the biggest or greatest support for, or greatest application that was supported by the general public was anything to do with disaster or emergency response. So that's things like firefighting, search and rescue, police use, disaster response, or anything to support oil spills. The next greatest support was for scientific research. So that might be things like using drones to monitor volcanoes, or using drones or uncrewed aircraft to monitor ocean monitoring or archaeology. So other areas that were had fairly high support was agricultural or horticultural or forestry purposes. environmental, so anything to do with conservation or preserving the environment. Government purposes, but this was a little bit more specific. This was things like border control or anything in the military but unarmed specifically, terrorism, so protecting the nation from terrorism, poaching, or controlling drug trafficking. Infrastructure and building support also had quite high support, so that would be things like monitoring railways or construction, highway and bridge inspection. Package delivery was on the list of acceptable applications, but only when it was for the public good, so things like medical delivery or food delivery, such as in a disaster or emergency type situation. Photography and videography were also on the acceptable application list, things like filmmaking or sports events, and then recreational. So recreational, this was acceptable and unacceptable because there's such a big gap in the research participants. Any research that had participants who were younger, towards the 13 to 21-year-old area, they supported unmanned aircraft or uncrewed aircraft for recreational events like drone racing. Anyone a little bit older than 21, they tended to not support recreational uncrewed aircraft. So some of the unacceptable applications, according to the research participants, were surveillance. So this is anything like traffic monitoring for speeding tickets or spying in general, crime prevention. So this was more, crime prevention was more places like America, where there's very low trust in the police or the government. Insurance claims, so anywhere where someone's using uncrewed aircraft to be able to claim insurance, that was very much unacceptable. Package delivery, where it was purely for an individual, was unacceptable. So that's things like Amazon. Photography, videography also came on the less, also was a little bit less favoured. And again, this is more when it favoured the individual. So for things like wedding photography, where it's just the couple that are benefiting rather than the whole, the public as a whole. Advertising or media or news gathering. Government purposes, so this was anything that's was not on the acceptable list, so things not like monitoring the borders or drug traffic, protecting drug trafficking. So it was more of things like if the government were using uncrewed aircraft for surveillance or watching people, monitoring people, that was more likely to be less favourable. Generally, any commercial purposes tended to be unacceptable as far as the public was concerned. Recreational, so once you got over that 21-year-old age bracket, recreational went back onto the unacceptable application list. So, and this was personal use by anyone, whether it was adults or children. And a lot of this research also included air taxi, and that was only on the unacceptable application list. So overall, support for an application depended on the purpose. So for example, photography and videography were both on the acceptable list and the unacceptable list. So if the participant, the researcher participant agreed with the purpose, then they're more likely to support. So for example, if the photography was for tobacco advertising, the participant was more likely to say no, they didn't support photography or videography. Whereas if it was a more favourable product for advertising, then they were more likely to be more favourable towards it. In general, any application that benefited society as a whole was more favourable, more acceptable than anything that benefited an individual. So the public also had opinions on who was an acceptable operator. So generally, government operators or government pilots had greater support than commercial or recreational pilots. This did fluctuate depending on the country. So participants from the US were less supportive of the government or police use of unmanned aircraft, and as opposed to participants from Singapore had a lot higher support for government use of uncrewed aircraft. As far as the location, acceptable areas, there weren't a lot of acceptable areas for unmanned uncrewed aircraft. Industrial areas had some support, but very, very little support from any age group for residential or anything around private housing. Some of the common concerns that the public had are misuse of the uncrewed aircraft. So things like using the uncrewed aircraft to transport explosives, and I don't mean in a military way, I mean just a general public person using uncrewed aircraft. So bear in mind that this is international research, so unlikely, I would imagine it would happen in New Zealand. Misuse in transport, using uncrewed aircraft to transport illegal drugs, unauthorized use to secure locations. So a lot of the countries that were researched had nuclear power plants. So many of the research participants were quite concerned about how you would keep uncrewed aircraft away from those sort of locations. Hacking to steal uncrewed aircraft data. So the uncrewed aircraft, or steal the data. Misuse in using it to surveillance of people or property, or intentionally using the uncrewed aircraft to hurt someone. Violation of privacy, that was a very high level of concern around privacy. So in general, participants felt that there's just not enough regulations to protect their privacy. Either there was concern about privacy from either a government operator or an individual operator using uncrewed aircraft to monitor them in private or public spaces. One other concern around privacy is that the difficulty of identifying the uncrewed aircraft operator or pilot to be able to hold them accountable should they post personal photos or video online without a person's knowledge or their consent. Malfunction or damage. The research participants had concerns about whether the uncrewed aircraft could fall from the sky and hurt someone or damage property. And if it was package delivery, whether or not the package may fall from the sky and be lost or damaged. Some more common uncrewed aircraft concerns were safety. So this was mostly specifically about remotely piloted aircraft. So a lot of the participants felt that the remotely piloted aircraft was becoming more popular, but the regulations were still fairly low with licensing and registration. They felt possibly younger or recreational reckless pilots might be matched with an inability to track the remotely piloted aircraft. They were concerned about the quality and the design of the aircraft. Inexperienced pilots, and then concerns if the uncrewed aircraft was being used for medical delivery. They were quite concerned about the medicines being delivered to the wrong person. Noise wasn't really a major concern, but it was reported as a concern in several articles. Legal liability, so that was concerns about the legal rights of the public. So for flights of the uncrewed aircraft over private property, mostly there were concerns about the pilot being anonymous, and it would make it very difficult to hold anyone accountable should the pilot be breaking the law. They also had concerns that there's just not one regulator for uncrewed aircraft, so it's complicated with privacy and sector regulations. And also a little bit about function creep. So perhaps an uncrewed aircraft operator may get approval for one application, but they may push those limits a little bit. And then finally, not a major concern, but job losses was also mentioned in some of the articles. So some of the solutions that researchers came up with perhaps transparency in the operations. So, for example, giving the public the ability to identify the pilot or the company or the operation. Tighter regulations for uncrewed aircraft. Increasing public knowledge. So overall, the greater the knowledge, the more positive a participant was towards uncrewed aircraft. So that's why they thought that might be that might help. And then at a minimum, knowledge decreased some of the concerns around privacy or the uncrewed aircraft dropping from the sky. They also came up with a number of specific solutions, things like geofences or permanent no-fly zones or registration for the uncrewed aircraft, mandatory licensing, backup systems or regular technical inspections, or generally consequences for those who break the regulations. From all of this research, what I noticed the most was the lack of discussion on how the public could identify the unmanned aircraft purpose from looking at the uncrewed aircraft. So there was a lot of discussion about what was acceptable and what was unacceptable purposes for the uncrewed aircraft, but no discussion on how the member of public could recognise what the uncrewed aircraft was actually doing, or how the public could identify if the operator was a government or commercial operator, because there was quite clearly a distinction between how the government was an acceptable operator, but commercial operators not so much. And then there also, none of their research had any acknowledgement of the fact that uncrewed aircraft pilots are pilots. An uncrewed aircraft, a drone, is an aircraft, and it would be completely unacceptable in crewed aviation to approach a pilot during a flight with a baseball bat. However, it seems to be more acceptable in the research to go and talk to a uncrewed aircraft pilot or ground crew if you're unhappy. So that is my presentation today, and these are all the references. Back to you, Aly.
Cool, thanks, Claire. Oh, I think my system's just frozen. Yeah, I think it's super, super valuable for somebody like yourself to go in and give that research a thorough digging into, and certainly some useful insights in there for all of us. We do have another poll in there, which is, thinking about the New Zealand context, what do you think are the key reasons the public don't accept UAVs? So if you've got a particular idea, pop that in there. A couple of people have observed that poll doesn't let you write particularly lengthy answers. So if you'd like to drop something in the chat instead, you're most welcome to. Murray has said that I think all media and official publicity has taught the public to think they know the rules, but nowhere has anyone written what 102 professional operators may be able to do. Therefore, the public think we're all rule breakers. And Peter has commented that he agrees with Murray and says most of his conversations with the public consist of explaining what the difference is between what we are allowed to do and why compared to the recreational user. That's certainly something that that's some feedback that we've heard at CAA as well. And there's actually a question in the Q&A, a couple of questions in the Q&A section that the public needs the regulator to say drones are okay, providing operators have 101 and 102. And somebody else has said, do we think it would be helpful for CAA to make it a policy that whenever we're discussing property overflight in the media, that it must be mentioned in the story that some or most 102 operators are able to operate above property without prior consent? Yeah, certainly. I probably wouldn't go so far as to call it a policy, but we're definitely trying to be a little bit more factual in that rather than that black and white 101 thing. And I can give you a contemporary example just from this morning. We've had a media inquiry about somebody asking about people flying drones over the Hikoi Motetiriti and whether or not that's allowed and what they might have to do and related to the controlled airspace and that kind of thing as well. So yeah, it's certainly something where it's challenging because, as you can probably all agree, it's a fairly nuanced area, and 102 the rule part doesn't actually say explicitly what people can do. So when we're talking to people who don't know anything about civil aviation rules and may want to go and find a reference for that, it doesn't really take them to a place where they can find a definitive answer. So it is quite challenging, and sometimes we have to think about who we're communicating to, but it's certainly something that we've been reflecting on and taking into more consideration. So I'll just have a quick look at the word cloud. I think I can share that somehow. Will it let me share it on the screen? Okay, I'm just going to share my screen so you can see what I see. Where's it gone? Here we go. So the primary thing that's coming up there is definitely privacy. And then a couple of other things there: toys not tools, bad publicity, negative media. So yeah, I think we're sort of all on the same page that, you know, what is in the public discussion definitely contributes to whether or not people accept UAVs, but certainly that most people are worried about their privacy, and that's consistent with my own experience since I've been in the organisation, the kinds of inquiries that I've seen, particularly coming through the media side of things. It seems that everybody seems to think that if there's a drone in the sky, it's spying on them. So certainly not the case. All right, Ben, we'll jump into your presentation. Fire away.
All right, thanks for that, Aly. And yeah, it's interesting to think that some people doing your promoting that it's perhaps unacceptable, you know, as a professional organisation. It does seem a little bizarre that people might perceive what you're doing as being unacceptable. You know, you wouldn't think a school teacher would get that kind of perception. So I'm Ben Brown, so service delivery manager for Digital Asset Capture. So it is a bit of a wordy title, but essentially I am heading the adoption of UAV technology and ground capture technology within Programmed, which is a pretty big company. So we're a leading provider of facility management, maintenance, operations, and staffing. So 1 in 1,000 in APAC are employed by Programmed. So it's pretty massive. So we've got 380 staff across 14 offices across New Zealand and 30,000 across 200 sites in Australia. So we have a pretty wide reach. But the bit that I want to focus on today is really just the risk around our UAV operations. For over 4 years, we've been utilising digital asset capture, asset digitization as a part of the facility management and maintenance ecosystem. That's using drones and LiDAR ground capture technology, effectively to offer our clients visibility over their data, which drives them, while most importantly keeping this is one of our South Island drone pilots, Patrick. He's up the top of the Southern Alps there. I've got a bit of a video of that same location too, which is quite neat. The program is a traditionally conservative company, so getting this type of technology into the tool kit has its challenges, but really at the end of the day it's just about managing risk. So the main risks that we see that are associated with our drone operations are, well, they come under certain headings. So collision with other manned aircraft or other UAVs, other structures, loss of control, so technical failure, pilot error, the cybersecurity piece, so data interception or hacking, the environmental part, weather, wildlife, it's always a hassle, and not in there as well as not wildlife, so horses and cattle. Operational, so battery failure, maintenance, regulatory non-compliance. The human factor, the Swiss cheese model is active quite considerably every day. Fatigue, distraction, and experience. But public perception is one of our key risks. And we find that when we're dealing with public, their concerns mainly are pretty much the same as our cloud around privacy, safety, and nuisance. This is a little bit on what we do. So the program works with a lot of large facilities. So we're talking schools, parks, stadiums. We've got Auckland Council. There's also some big telecommunications providers, as well as the national grid operator. So we deal with some pretty high risk sites, and managing those risks are really something that we do all day, every day. This is a big project over in Kangaroo Island in Australia. So of course, New Zealand being the brave first adopter within the company, we've managed to get adoption across Australia as well. This is one of our Auckland Council jobs, a new park we're building on Waiheke Island. Of course, we use all sorts of payload types. I think the main point is we've got a very eclectic group of sites. So we could be working in the middle of nowhere in one instance with a drone, and we could be working right up against a school kindergarten in an urban area. So we've got to really respond, I think, to the type of location that we're the type of risk that exists at the different variety of locations. So the privacy perception concerns that we seem to come across are mainly related to privacy, safety, and nuisance. So surveillance anxiety is a real thing. Concern over invasion of privacy. The idea of being observed without consent is quite a big objection when we're doing our drone operations. The concern for misuse of captured footage is quite a big one. Fear of accidents, Personal injury or property damage is quite a big one. Incidents being sensationalized by the media, which is essentially skewing the understanding of the risk versus benefit. It's not particularly helpful when you do have stories in the media that sensationalize in the wrong direction. Interference with manned aircraft, of course. Drones being used in modern warfare. Now, this is quite a new issue for us, but there are actually people that are genuinely scared when they see a drone in the air, and there are a few people around now that have been triggered by post-traumatic stress. So that's something that we hadn't really seen until very recently. General negative public perception, the noise is of course an issue, the disruptive buzzing, perceived impact on wildlife, and drones being perceived as a toy rather than a professional tool. This is a fairly sort of typical place in an urban environment that would be flying. It's a telecommunications building. As you can see, we've got all of our signage out, lots of cones, lots of barriers. There was actually a walking school bus that went past here as we were flying this. Just reinforces the point of being visible and having all of the safety considerations taken into account before you engage in operations like this. So for mitigation, having a professional appearance. So we were talking about the signage, the vehicles, uniform branding, business cards. So just looking professional really helps. Being visible. So if the public need to look for the UAV operator when they're investigating who owns the drone that they're being offended by, that complainant or that objector gets increasingly agitated. It doesn't really help if they can't see who's operating it. If you preempt any issues, if it's a complex site, by pre-alerting police to the operation, because of course they're the most likely to be first called by the public. Understanding generational differences in perception, so knowing that if you have an elderly person, they might not understand what's going on. There are some generational differences. At a rest home, I did have a person there turn up and mention that they weren't too sure what was going on. So taking the time to explain it was really key there. Assurance of data security is quite key. From the safety perspective, a no surprises approach, ensuring that everyone on the boundary of the operational area is aware of your presence, with either printed collateral in the letterbox, door knocking, that sort of thing, and then ensuring that those boundaries are respected and followed. So highlighting positive narratives in the media, with press releases and marketing material on work being undertaken. Safety operator, lone worker platform, which I've got a little bit more on coming up. Showing that a risk analysis has been undertaken is quite important. Explaining the purpose when you're talking about mitigating nuisance objections. Showing public that this is it isn't a toy rather than a tool. So we quite often say, "Hey, would you like to have a look at what we're doing?" And that tends to de-escalate it quite a bit. Other de-escalation techniques are really handy as well. Alternative solutions for actually capturing the data that we need. So perhaps a different time of day. If it's a kindergarten, maybe they might want us to come back after hours. Same thing with a school. Empathy and respect is really key. Listening to concerns. Apologizing is a really big one. regardless of whether they're wrong. I mean, if you're just talking about de-escalation, what does it matter? You just continue on with your job. If it allows you to do that, apologies can get you quite far. Most issues can be solved with a friendly conversation. This is a photo mosaic that shows most of our projects to date, which just kind of shows just the eclectic sort of nature of the locations. This is a telecommunications tower that we work on. This is a video that we showed recently to an audience in the States because it has a few sheep in the background. And for some reason, Americans love sheep. This is the Get Home Safe platform that we use by all of our drone pilots in the field as a monitoring system. So it's got automatic tracking, a workday timer, check-in, accident alerting, without mobile coverage. That's the whole point, is that it's a GPS transceiver. It links to our e-road vehicle tracker platform, enables two-way text messaging via satellite using a dedicated Australian emergency. That's meant to say. It's got a dedicated phone number, and you can call emergency services if required. So there's also an SOS function as well, which operators can trigger at any point, which means that no matter where they are, if they're working in the middle of nowhere, we've got access to communicate, and they've got access to be able to trigger emergency and non-emergency communications as well. So our principles of approach, so we've got quite an ingrained HSEQ ethos. So governance is really strong. So this is really important, I think, to develop a strong RPAS operation. So strong governance to ensure compliance with regulations. So we're Part 102, Part 102 certificated. We've got a drone policy for our company within Australia and New Zealand. We've got some quite strong JSEA guidelines as well. So managing risk and safety is really critical to our approach. And this is a video of one of the more remote sites that we, well, example of the remote sites. This is at the top of Southern Alps. We were there scanning this telecommunications repeater station. So as you can imagine, there are certain types of risks that exist here, not necessarily privacy from a school next door, but you definitely have the risks when you're working at the top of a mountain. So this is a pretty standard. It's pretty breathtaking footage there. And that's more or less it from me.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. I think, you know, there's probably a lot of people on the call who are also out there working with UAVs every day, and you guys are the ones dealing with the public and probably have the best anecdotal experiences to share about the issues that you face and what people have to say, and, you know, what people are getting up in your grill about. So thanks for sharing your experiences, and certainly some very impressive footage that you've got there as well. We've just got 10 minutes left, and want to make sure that we sort of guide the discussion the way that you guys in the audience want to. We did have a question in the poll there about what's the impact on your operations from the public not accepting UAVs. Just a quick overview of the answers there. Time wasting, security, minor impact, confrontation. extra work for you, suspicion, staff safety, anxiety, less access, grounding, and unpopulated. I'm not quite sure what that means. So yeah, a variety of things and ways that can impact different operations. And then the last question in the poll here is possibly something that we can go into about whose problem is it to solve. Feel free to chime in and add your answer there. I'm just going to keep refreshing the screen so I make sure that I get the most recent versions of those. While you're answering that, there is somebody's put a question, Richard, in the Q&A. Public acceptance is a two-way street. The regulator, since this was raised to Steve Moore in 2017, has always maintained public acceptance as an industry challenge. However, the public need the regulator to say drones are okay, providing operators have Part 101 and 102. What will CAA do to help our industry gain better acceptance from the public? So I spoke to this a little bit briefly before, just talking about, accepting that we change our language slightly and do refer to 102. The challenge for us as a regulator is that we regulate safety, we regulate operators, so we don't actually have any regulatory powers over the public. Now, that's not to say that there isn't something we can do. It's just the sort of broad question of should we. But my participation on the UAV working group around this is a step in the direction of, we can consider doing something to support this work. But in the broad scheme of things, it's not really the right approach for CAA to exclusively lead this public acceptance work, but yeah, certainly open to contributing to it. So I'll just skip through some of the other questions there. Quite a bit of chat, comments in the chat around would it help for 102 expositions to be available for the public to view? What about would it be better to have more licenses? Somebody has pointed out that has been talked about. As far as I am aware, this was a key consideration in the Ministry of Transport's integration of drones work from a few years ago. I think the challenge with licenses is that when in the situation, people aren't always able to identify who the drone operator is, or they may not be nearby you, so they can't necessarily walk up to you and say, do you have a license? So that in itself may not entirely solve the problem, but there certainly are a range of these ideas that have been floating around. Somebody suggested leafleting in the area, and that's fairly common for operators. Somebody else has commented that sharing of exposition isn't a good idea because it's often intellectual property, and that sharing operational specs is. So there's a range of possibilities there. I think I won't say yay or nay or what direction CAA would go in terms of anything mandatory, but certainly could be something for us to discuss at the working group level about where there would be some kind of voluntary system that might assist. So yeah, I'll take note of all your comments there and we can take that to the group. So just going back to the polls. So sorry, I'm just refreshing my screen again. So whose problem is it to solve? We've got a range of answers there. Quite a few people saying everyone's problem, all of us, industry, UAV sector, UAV users. Somebody said industry and regulator. Industry and suppliers need to do public promotion campaign through schools, social media, and the public. Somebody said central lobbying and quote propaganda group unquote, and put UAVNZ in brackets. I'm not sure if I'd entirely agree that UAVNZ is a propaganda group, but I think I can understand the sort of point behind your statement there. And I think, what I'm pleased about there is that, there is a shared sense of responsibility. CAA, we're certainly wanting to make sure that there isn't a safety risk around people in the public, raging at drone operators, and that's where Claire's research has been really, really interesting. It's certainly the preliminary findings. Jumping back into the Q&A. Somebody said, we have been keen on a licensing system, but I'm told CAA are not keen on this. Do you know why? I don't know definitively, and certainly not definitively enough to say it on a recorded call, because I wouldn't want to say the wrong thing or set up the wrong expectation. But I do understand that there's considerations around specifically what problem are you trying to solve with licensing, and whether licensing is a clear answer to that problem. So I'm not entirely sure of our policy position on that, but I could certainly have a look into it and see what I can find out. Right, Ben and Claire, do you want to jump back on with your videos and mics and weigh in on any of those comments in the chat? Ben, you certainly as an operator with a lot of experience, do you have a different point of view to share about any of those comments, or a similar point of view that you'd like to share?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you're kind of damned if you don't, damned if you don't, regardless of what you do. I think you're always going to have people objecting. But yeah, going back, using the phrase acceptable and unacceptable from Claire's research kind of makes me look again at how people are viewing you out in the field. But yeah, whether or not we would have any less issues for people if we waved around our exposition rather than our 102 certificate, I suspect not, because they're not really interested in having a conversation. They're more coming at you with offence that can just be mitigated with a conversation, rather than going into the nitty gritty of it, because of course that means you'd have to park your operation as well. You'd have to land and run through pages 1 through 50. I can't see that as being practical in the field.
One thing with the acceptable, unacceptable, that's all on paper. That's all what the public have said on paper. And that was the biggest takeaway from the research for me, is they haven't actually talked about how the public would identify what you were actually doing. And one thing I noticed with my research, which I found quite surprising, is the majority of my research participants, which was the drone pilots or the ground crew, they were wearing high-vis. They did have cars that had names, company names. They had uniforms on. They had signs. Some of them have got some absolutely fantastic ways of identifying themselves, and yet they still had the aggression. So yeah,
there's not really much more you can do in the field than be visible and not surprise people. So no. I think you're always going to have issues, but I think it's just minimizing them.
Yeah,
that's
going to be the challenge going forward.
Is there anybody in the audience who wants to speak up? We do have the option to allow your microphone to be turned on. This is a open thing, so if you've got a particularly succinct point you'd like to make, feel free to raise your hand and I can turn on the microphones. All right, no takers. We are closing in right on 2 o'clock, so I think the takeaways from today, at least from my perspective, are that it's widely accepted that there are people out in the public who aren't aware of drones or what they're for and why they should be there, and then also some people who are aware of those things and really don't care. They just don't like drones at all, and a range of different options or opportunities about how we might influence that. So I'm certainly taking that away with my thinking cap on of what we might discuss at our working group around this. If anybody has ideas to contribute to that haven't come up today, feel free to email myself or Claire or Ben. We're really open to your thoughts, and yeah, it is, I think, what we can probably all agree on is that there is, to a degree, a problem that we all need to work together to solve. So yeah, feel free to contribute your ideas, and we'll might come knocking on your door when we get some clear recommendations and need some people to jump on board and help champion the work. So we'll wrap it up there for now, and thank you all for coming. It's been great to have a chat.
Awesome. Thanks, Aly. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Claire and Ben, for sharing your presentation.
Aly and Ben.